You can see you say securing your cloud with Azure services. And if anyone is not seeing that, let's just have a look. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, with the welcome. Is everyone hearing me okay? Anyone not? Well, if you can't hear me, you won't be able to tell me. But hopefully you'll see me just moving my mouth and such in there. All right. And yeah, a few more joining us there as well by the looks of things. So yes, this is a webinar, as you can see, for securing your cloud with Azure services. Just a brief background on myself. As you can see, that's me, Mark Elliott. I just mentioned I'm based in Wellington in New Zealand. Um, IT background goes back initially to back in 1994 when I first started getting involved on that side. Initially training back in the late 90s when I started getting into the Microsoft products and became an MCT, a Microsoft Certified Trainer. But a few other things, obviously, over the time there, as some of you have probably delved with, lots of virtualization. And I kind of started playing around with a lot more security, in actual fact, in those sort of late 90s, early 2000s, working with and delivering things like EC Council courses. So ethical hacking, pen testing, and doing a few sort of government-based contracts I had with things like USTOD there. So with regards to our content, we are, say, going through this webinar. Please, if you've got any questions, just pop them into the chat. We'll also look back at those towards the end there, or you can always ask the questions at the end as well, whichever is your preference. So yeah, popping them in there. So don't be concerned if I don't kind of answer the question maybe immediately within that chat. To, as I say, just fill it in. We'll have a look back at it towards the end and then have some discussions there as we get towards the end of obviously the webinar. So let me, without further ado, just make sure I've got my pen enabled on my machine here as well, which is, yeah. Oh, and now it doesn't want to erase. There we go. Yes, it does. Cool. So let's move that out the way. All right. Seems like we're back on track here anyway. So as I was saying, introduction to the concepts and services. Now, one thing that some of you, if not all of you, may well be familiar with when we start talking about cloud-based environments is they discuss the likes of shared responsibility. And can I get a bit of a feedback maybe? Are we all familiar with maybe Azure or AWS or GCP, some form of cloud in there? Maybe you pop something in there to give me a bit of feedback. Yes, familiar with those? No, not at all. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bimal. And apologies if I said the name incorrectly. Andrew, yes. Nada, yes. Thank you. Okay, so there's a few there that have that familiarity. So once again, thanks, Paul. You'll find that anytime you talk about any cloud infrastructure, they will always discuss the responsibility models. So what you'll find in the case of the Azure-based environment is that you may be used to maybe terms like managed services, unmanaged services, or things like serverless. You'll see the references in here talk about the as a service type options. There we go. So our IaaS, our PaaS, and our SaaS, so infrastructure, platform, software as a service, which would then be based on obviously the responsibility. So if you was going and deploying something like a virtual machine into the Azure environment, it is your responsibility from the security perspective to manage and maintain the operating system, the applications, plus other things you can see in that IaaS column here. If we was to start talking about maybe using some of the managed type services or going into the sort of serverless based environment, maybe using Azure Functions, etc., then the responsibility model changes. And as I say, that's very typical. So whether you're looking in any cloud platform, you're going to see that sort of discussion around who is responsible for what. Also, there's that very big discussion of DID. or defense in depth, using a layered approach. Now, again, when we talk about these aspects, when you move into that cloud infrastructure, the first one we see here, things like physical security, is probably something that we're going to go, oh, well, it's not my responsibility because I don't have to worry about that. And Robert, you had a question there? If you can maybe pop it into the chat window there at all. I'm not sure whether I'm just seeing from the webinar perspective. So I'm not sure whether or not that Fiona has actually enabled the microphones for you guys as well from your perspective. So maybe just pop it in the chat window and then we'll continue obviously from there if you can. So with that defense in depth strategy, you can see a little bit more of the focus is going to be from that sort of identity and access perspective down. Yeah, so when we talk about identities down here, we commonly see things like Entra being mentioned. When we start getting into this kind of level of perimeter, networking, compute application, we say, right, well, if I'm going to deploy something like a virtual machine, I'm going to go and create something like a VNet. My VMs are going to sit in that VNet on a subnet. They're going to have network interfaces, and we're going to start discussing how we would actually secure the VNet, the network, the interface card in there as well. So those different layers, putting in multiple layers as part of that defense in-depth approach. You also have that reference to the zero trust. So very much in this day and age, we talk about that trust no one and verify everything. So when we start talking about some of the services, we're going to say, well, what types of devices are people using? What's the identities? How are they authenticating to our environment? So essentially, when we think about, you can see what we mentioned as foundational pillars here. Identities, something like a user, a service, or a device. Applications, how do we consume those applications, and the data when we talk about that should be classified, should be labeled, should be encrypted as a default. So looking at all of those aspects in there as well. When you're looking at things like infrastructure components, whether there is a specific threat and what types of tools will be used to effectively monitor and report based on those there as well. So some of the main key components based around things like that responsibility model, based around the zero trust, etc. One of the first things when we talk about access, oh, why has that still got the highlighter on there? There we go, that's gone now. One of the things we talk about here is Entra ID. So some of you that may have had familiarity with this from previous may have come across terms like Azure AD. So that was relabeled, changed a couple of years ago now, and became Entra, so Entra ID. And it is an identity management solution. So we typically focus predominantly on the first aspects of authenticating someone and saying, do they or can they authenticate? And then once they've authenticated, what are they authorized to do? Now, there are different licensing. You can see it mentions here things like P1s, P2s. So you will see some of the things we talk about and just mention in these set of slides, as well as what we cover in the security courses, will be based on licensing. So let me just go and grab a URL for you here. And let's grab, if I move that out of the way, the Entra plans and pricing one. And I'm just going to pop this into the chat window there. Okay, thank you, Fiona, for that confirmation. So for those that want that reference, you can see this is just pulled straight from the Microsoft site. So you can see comparisons around the P1, P2 licensing and Entra Suite or standalone products in here. So you can come down here and effectively say, oh, well, with Entra ID through things like P1 and P2 licensing, would I get conditional access? Yes. Do I get the standard role-based access control? Yes. If I'm maybe discussing Entra ID protection, do I have things like risk-based conditional access in here? And you can see that would be something like P2 licensing or Entra Suite. So it is one of those areas, as I say, that it is important to understand what type of licensing you would be using based on the types of things you want to use, conditional access, privileged identity management, for example. So, yes, one of the first things there is to talk about implementing the Entra ID identity protection. And what you can see from this screenshot is it talks about, firstly up the top, the reference to a policy, policy name, multi-factor authentication registration policy, user risk remediation, sign-in risk remediation. So when we're starting to talk about these aspects, we are looking at, just like you would in an on-prem scenario, what looks like normal behavior. You need to effectively look at the likes of the users and say, where are they typically signing in from? So if we're accessing the Azure environment, predominantly in the Asia Pacific region, are they always logging in from there? And then if someone is logging in from a different location, i.e. Europe, the US, for example, then what should we do about it? How do we assess that risk and what should we do when that type of thing effectively occurs? So you can see based on the identity side, we are talking about, as always nowadays, that requirement around things like MFA. You'll actually see if you was logging into the Entra portal. Actually, I think I'll just show you that quickly. That if I brought this over here and I said, let's go into Entra ID, you should, hopefully, although it's going to make me look, as I say, and is it going to pop up? It's not going to pop up for me there, is it? So when you first log in here, you will actually find that that typically pops up with a notification. Now, I think it's by October, it's about 2 weeks' time. I think it's around about the 16th of October or something, that MFA is now a requirement on your account. And if you don't have it, then it will just pop up messages to say, let's make sure that we do go and enforce that. We talk about things like passwordless authentication. And yeah, we do tend to see a lot more references to these types of options nowadays as a preferred. I think we've all, over the years, probably had lots of different passwords. And therefore, in that scenario, you've said, oh, where do I store all of these? And you may have tools that you store for password management potentially. But it does talk about enhancing your security, mitigating things like password attack risks. I think we've seen over the years when people have, maybe gone to a specific website that they've signed up and then potentially something occurs and there's a vulnerability there. People have got a password database, they've extracted that. Your information is obviously now viable to be utilized in some manner. So we have options in Microsoft, things like Authenticator, and I'm sure that most of you have used some form of multi-factor authentication, whether it's a hardware-based, like a Gemalto key fob, whether you've used things like FIDO keys, whether you've utilized virtual MFA, like the Authenticator application, or others out there as well. So as it says, Microsoft offers passwordless options, Authenticator, Hello, FIDO2 keys, so certificate-based authentication in there as well. So something like PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, is when we're thinking about something like a just-in-time access, then we might discuss the fact that there is something like, let's just put it onto a screen here. Oh, I meant to, let's change that to my pin. Something like a VM that someone out here wants to gain access to. Now, let's just assume that that's something like a Microsoft machine. And we talk about accessing this over things like RDP. So Remote Desktop Protocol 3389 is the port number. So in that scenario, we might say, look, we've got a rule in place here that says, okay, yes, we can allow port 3389 access, but then it's based on what we do here. How do we do these sort of verifications of something like this user? We just saw an example requiring MFA. So maybe in that scenario, if that person hasn't used multi-factor authentication, then we can say, no, that's not meeting our specific requirements. So you talk about maybe time-based. So this person's trying to access this between the time, let's say 2 o'clock in the morning, but that's not permitted. So it's all part of that sort of aspect of, yes, this is just an example of obviously trying to access this virtual machine and saying that, yeah, we're going to let you access that, but only based on you meeting these requirements, based on that privileged identity. So enable things like just in time, offers role management, activation, approval processes. So again, if we're talking about this particular person trying to gain access to a specific service or an application that you're running in Azure, then you might say that has to be approved. So that's going to go off to someone as an approver, and they're going to say, yeah, check for this. Oh, no, that person's not permitted to access that. And they can obviously deny that specific request. So configuring things like PIM, as you can see, time-based, approval-based role activation for things like just-in-time, time-bound access, notifications, anytime a privileged role is used. So again, you get all of that detail in there. You get the justification as to why. Why did this user activate it? What's the reasoning behind it? Obviously, the full audit trail, as you would expect here as well. And when we're keeping that discussion around the identities, the third part of a AAA would be once we've authenticated and authorized, we now need to audit, essentially. We need an audit trail. So we want to review things like access, looking at the likes of what occurred in our account. And essentially, again, this is kind of one of those key components when we're discussing, does this look suspicious or not? So part of that sort of signing user risk assessments in here as well. Things like conditional access policies. So you can see the term signal being referenced here, first of all. So a bit like I briefly just mentioned previously, it may be based on where the user is currently. Now, I personally, probably prior to the COVID scenario, I used to regularly fly from NZ to Australia, Singapore, and maybe further afield in some cases. So I would talk about when I was trying to access maybe certain services in a cloud environment, how would it verify? And we've probably all seen this, to be honest. Nowadays, accessing an application, it might say, oh, yeah, you normally go and log in from NZ in my case, and that looks normal. So why all of a sudden are you trying to now access this application from the United States when you don't typically do this? So we can look at those as part of that conditional access policy, and as I say, check for things like users, location, and you see these verification steps. Are you going to go and verify and say, yeah, let's allow them access to that resource, or block them access, or maybe just require them to use multi-factor authentication in there? So as part of that, as it says, real-time risk assessment in here. Whether it's a device, maybe in your organization, you've provided all of your users with something like a laptop. So that can be one of those signals that even though the user may be in a different location, they're using the device that's been provided by the company. So you have, the form of control over that specific device as well. So at their simplest, it does say conditional access policies are if-then statements. So you're looking for a signal based on this. Oh, is it this? Is it this? If that, then do this. Whether that then is a block, allow, or whether that's require MFA, then that's what we do. Yeah, so we look at those different types of options. You can see things like IP location is mentioned here as well. Now on your VNet side, when we're looking at that defense in depth approach, and again, if we kind of just revisit, where is my screen? That one there in the defense in depth, we talked about things like the identity and access. You're now discussing your perimeter, your networking aspects in here. So coming into here for our virtual networking, you may have had some exposure again within the Azure or possibly other cloud environments about creating your own networks and your own sort of cloud-based environment. When you then set that process up, you've got to think about how you're going to provide connectivity, sorry, not activity, provide connectivity to those. Just like that virtual machine I mentioned previously, how am I going to open up port 3389? So you see here steps like what we call NSGs, network security groups, ASGs, application security groups, part of that tiered approach. Planning and implementing your VNets and connecting other VNets as necessary. So again, don't do it just because you can do it. That's one of the security aspects here, is only do it if required. So just because you can do something doesn't mean it's the best practice in there. Connecting from on-prem, securing things like VPNs, talking about if I want to use the internet to connect in, there's an option here. Make sure it's secure. If not, have I got like a dedicated connection? Am I using something called ExpressRoute? And if I am, then enforcing or implementing encryption across that ExpressRoute connection in there as well. So Azure does offer services like DDoS protection. And, if you just was looking at that aspect, as is commonly seen as again in cloud environments, they're thinking about protect everything from any potential ingress. So they could be coming in from somewhere that doesn't have a specific, say, availability zone, or, you might say, yep, there's a point of presence there. So when we start talking about any ingress location, and egress, we want to protect it against that DOS or DDoS attacks. So there is the Azure DDoS service, which again is very typical of cloud environments to talk about how much or how many features you want with that, which would then determine what version of that DDoS protection you might actually be using. Something like Azure Firewall. So what we see in this picture here is very much for anyone that may be familiar, and you might have possibly used third-party services in your on-prem and other clouds to say, look, before I actually send this out to the internet, I've got to send it through a firewall product. Now, again, this is part of that defense in depth. It's kind of looking at that perimeter aspect, because if you was talking about these words like VNet here, you might say, right, okay, I've gone and created a VNet for these guys running those virtual machines, and I've got another VNet over here. Oh, sorry, VNet over here. Those are connected on subnets. So from the VNet perspective, you can use NSGs here. Now, essentially that instance is connected to, as I say, a subnet, and you can associate the security group to the subnet. But then to connect it to that subnet, you've got a network interface. So your network interface, we can also talk about applying security groups there. So essentially, when you get closer to the component, the object, you've got NSGs. When you start moving outside of that VNet, you start talking about options like Azure Firewall. And if you still want to do host-based firewalls inside of those virtual machines, you can. That's your choice. But essentially, inside of that VNet, one of the main components you'll see mentioned is the network security group, which can be applied at the network interface or the subnet level. When we're using Azure Firewall, it's more about that next hop address. So, okay, before I actually go to the internet, I'm going to send it into the firewall. That's going to do my inspection, and then it's going to go out. And if I'm connecting to on-prem, as we can see here as well, the same thing applies. So things like a web application firewall. And again, you may have familiarity with this in your on-prem or cloud environments already. We start to talk about the layer 7 requests. Now, with the web application firewall in the likes of the Azure-based environment, this is a layer 7 firewall product and a load balancer. So when those requests come in, you are talking about load balancing these requests, but providing the protection against things like threats. Oh, I didn't mean to cross through it. I should have changed it to my highlighter. Against threats and intrusions, protects, as it says, web application DDoS attacks and known vulnerabilities in one place. So if you're looking at things like protecting your environment against SQL injection, cross-site scripting flaws, then you start to talk about how that layer 7 firewall would be used in this case. And you'd commonly use this in conjunction with a DDoS protection as well. So I did mention that we have things like NSGs, and we have something called an application security group as well. So if you was to kind of just put this into perspective, if you had, let's say, a very typical front-end web servers with a mid-tier application with back-end databases, then you want to make the management of the security and the firewall in here secure as you need it as part of that defense, but also making sure that from what if I need to add an additional web server and scale this environment out, I don't have to do excessive amounts of work, like changing lots of different rules, for example. So when I've got something like an NSG, I might want to say, oh, well, it's coming from this web, but it's going to this app. And you could go in there and just do a simple rule like you would in a normal firewall environment. But we would generally talk about creating an application group called something like web servers, let's say in this case, and then an app servers down here. And then let's say DB servers down here. And then in that scenario, when we create our security group, we can say that this is the source, this is the destination. So therefore, if we do need to scale that environment and add another web, oh, that's part of the security group. We don't have to keep changing those. Very, very typical of software-defined networking if you've worked with that over the years, whether it's on-prem or cloud. So we have NSGs, we have ASGs for that purpose. Planning and implementing service for private access to resources. So if you have connected, let's say, from your on-prem, now it doesn't have to be from on-prem, but if you're coming into your virtual network that you've created in your Azure-based environment, do you want, let's say, that virtual machine here to go out to the internet and then come back into an Azure service? Let's say something like storage, for example. And in general, lots of cases are saying, oh, no, we don't want to do that because, it's unnecessary. So it's common to see the term endpoint being used here and services like Private Link so that we can effectively plug that service in to things like your VNet. So you don't have to go that direction. Instead, you kind of put a network interface here that allows it to connect to that service down there and keeps it on the Azure-based environment. Plan and implement security for public access. So when we talk about accessing resources in Azure, we are discussing that secure environment anyway. So using things like TLS, transport layer security. So do plan for that process, implement the likes of certificates and so on. And you can see words like firewalls. And if you've got multiple, as you can imagine, you would normally want to manage it centrally. So if you have something like Azure Firewall and you're saying, look, we need to create policies that apply to our organization, then let's go in here and let's use something like the Firewall Manager. So yeah, implement things like Azure Application Gateways, Front Door. So Front Door is based on the content delivery, the CDN. So if you've got something like, again, the likes of, let's say, a website that's running on your environment and you want to make it available globally without actually copying that resource into that location, then bring it closer to the customer so they get better access to that resource, quicker access, without actually copying the entire content. Yeah, so you talk about the content delivery network. Recommendations around things like DDoS and WAF, as we saw just before. So as I said, yeah, you just saw examples on one of the previous one about planning and implement a web application firewall. So you do talk about protecting against cross-site scripting, things like SQL injection, using the OWASP, top 10s and so on, core rule sets in there. So again, you've got recommendations that you've got as part of the web application firewall, and you can go in and create your own specific rule sets in here as well. Planning and implementing remote access to public endpoints, including something called Azure Bastion. So what you'll notice in this picture, firstly, we've got the use of TLS. So we're using transport layer security across the secure 443 connection. But then we're essentially saying, look, use a service like this so that you don't have to open up services like RDP and SSH. Yeah, if you're going and connecting to remote desktop protocol, you've got port 3389, SSH, port 22. We don't want you to open them to the world. So from a security perspective, use a service like Azure Bastion. And that's essentially a jump box. You know, it's like that jump box scenario of, okay, let's put that as the front end component. And you may well have done similar types of things. I don't know whether anyone here over the years may have used something called the remote desktop gateway in Microsoft environments. Then they would have essentially said that, again, we don't want to connect on 3389, what we do, but we don't want to open that port because that could be then prone to a brute force attack. So instead, what we'll do is we'll actually put in a service that provides a 443 connection, but essentially you're encapsulating that request inside of that. We would recommend that when you get down to that sort of application layer and you start talking about your virtual machines, that one of the protections there would be to inform or to think about the use of disk encryption. You know, having this as a default. Now, normally when we talk about this as a default, you're also going to start to use maybe some of the other service policies or security policy components that say we want to enforce this, because part of our compliance is going to check those machines, see if they currently have encryption enabled on these particular disks. And if they're not, then how do I go about automatically encrypting those? You know, so you kind of put in those policies that would effectively say, check for this once it's been verified. And that's kind of part of your configuration, your compliance requirements there as well. Things like Azure storage. You know, if we are using the storage accounts and we're storing a bunch of data there, then again, you want protection at rest. You actually want protection in transit. You want protection at rest. So we do go and suggest that, you know, okay, if I'm accessing this, I'm going to connect to it over a secure connection, like we said with TLS. But then when I connect to the back end, encrypt it. Yeah, and when we talk about storage accounts in Azure, you'll actually find that is a default anyway. It's more so if you want to change the defaults to your own keys in here. Also, other authorization methods to connect to that storage. You have options of using Entra. You have something called a shared access signature. So if you need to give someone kind of like a one-time access, then you might say, I'll give you access to that resource, but you must do it within a particular time. Because when you create and generate that signature, you can then say it's available from 2 p.m. until 3 p.m. And if they try to access it after that, they won't get access to the resource. So with things like data protection, we do have our typical recommendations in here. You see something called ARM. You may have seen that just on a couple of slides ago here. So ARM is Azure Resource Manager in here. So, and you can see with Azure Resource Manager, it says set up locks. Now the locks are just an extra layer of protection essentially, because you actually only have two types. You have a read-only lock and a delete lock. And therefore you can go in and say, look, they can't delete this particular resource. Yeah. So if I went into, let's just say my environment here, let's just go and pick on something like a virtual machine. I could pick on one of these, the Mark Dev, and let's just minimize that and look under, well, firstly under the security section, I'll show you there that, you've got the integration, as I say, with the identity, and it also mentions something called Defender, which will pop up shortly. But under our settings, you can see we've got our locks here, and it says it currently has no locks. So I could come in and give the lock a name, and you'll see there read only or delete. So let's just say, oh, DLE, DEL, let's say, and we'll change that to a delete lock. Let's just refresh that picture, and it should come up once it creates that resource lock. Once it creates that resource lock, did it actually? Oh, why is that not creating that? My notification still says it got no locks on it. Interesting. Let's try on my Linux machine. Oh, I've already got one on there anyway. So you'll see for that Linux machine, if I was to go to the overview page, oh, looks like it's not even started. And let's just say delete and apply that delete. I've read, and you see that failed to delete the machine. So based on an error occurred when deleting, you can see the details in there, and it will talk about the resource groups, and it says are locked. You can see that because of the following. So essentially it gives us another layer of protection in there, especially when you talk about things that have to be kept for X amount of time as part of maybe a governance requirement, then you can put those locks in there. Soft deletes. So we talk about things like soft deletes on containers and storage there as well. So, and things like versioning. You see here it says in blob storage, use blob versioning for overwrite events in here. So it is about enabling things like infrastructure encryption using things like 256-bit AES. It is FIPS 140-2 compliant. There are options when you are implementing key management in the Azure-based environment to get FIPS 140-3, if that is a requirement within your organization based on the Federal Information Processing Standards. And but it does say optional double encryption as well, which will add an additional layer of security. If you're deploying things like SQL, so using the structured query language, SQL databases, or managed instances, then if you're deploying the likes of, if you was putting in your own virtual machine and installing SQL, you would talk again about those layers of defense. Your data is stored inside of that object, so how are you protecting that information? How are you protecting against threats? How are you determining who can access this resource, and how are you providing the networking security here as well? So you can see on the left, it mentions things like firewalls, IP, virtual network rules in there as well. Something like Microsoft Purview. is, as it says, the solution in the governance portal. And you're talking about things like data, data classifications, etc. You can see the word data catalogs, data sharing, data maps, but we're not just discussing things in Azure. We are talking about things that would also be in your on-prem environment here. So when you're starting to get into maybe some of those discussions around payment card industries, PCI DSS requirements, then we have options here, like in the purview. I don't know why I always want to say purview with this. I don't know. I always want to put the E in there as well, but it is purview. Yeah. So apply classifications, as it says, which is a way of categorizing your data, your assets, talking about, you can see some common ones here, like phone numbers, other things like schema classifications, email addresses. And as we know, things are going to be different based on different countries. So how do we identify a driving license ID in NZ compared to Australia, compared to Europe, compared to the US? How do they write their phone numbers and their definitions in there? Things like the social security numbers in the case of the US. So there's all of those differences, zip codes, or, when we talk about some of those in, let's say, being from England myself, that used to be very typically 6 or 7 characters, combination of numbers and values. So 6 or 7, I think it was, well, I can remember one of my older ones, which was SS24JP, and when I used to live out, or we used to live out in Essex. So that was one kind of area code. But then when we lived in Florida, it was FL for Florida, obviously, and then 32828. And when we're in the kind of Wellington region, as I am here, the common one is 5018. So again, you're going to talk about the differences between different locations as part of those classifications here. If you're using your database options like Azure SQL, Azure Data Warehouse, then we do talk about using also transparent data encryption. So you can see here it says supports Azure SQL enabled by default on there. It also supports SQL managed instances and Synapse Analytics as well. Creating, assigning, and interpreting security policies. Now, you'll see some of these mentioned on this slide, CIS. So when we talk about CIS, for those that are not familiar, that's the Center for Internet Security. When you talk about maybe something like vulnerabilities, you would mention CVEs, common vulnerability exposures. So benchmarks, so, okay, what's my recommendations around how I secure this environment? So normally when we're talking about security, governance, compliance, we do mention things like policy. And one of the key things here is, stuff like, how do I get notified, about events and what's occurred in my policy? How do I remediate things? So if something occurs, and let's just say, like the disk encryption one I mentioned previously, that you check for compliance to see if a disk is encrypted, then how do you remediate it if it's not? So we talk about using the likes of the Azure policies there. And then when you are thinking on that bigger scale, configuring those security settings across your entire organization, then you hear terms like blueprints being used here as well. And this is kind of part of that governance across your org. So you make sure that they are in conformance with the requirements of your organization structure. So you can see things like policies and role assignments being mentioned here. As I say, we have a service called Azure Key Vault. This allows us to create crypto keys, but not just crypto. You can see here it does mention you can store things like passwords here. So it's a password management tool there as well for storing the likes of those. Also certificates. So the Azure Key Vault is not just crypto keys. You might find that other cloud providers you might look at may say, oh, we have separate services for these. They may have a certificate management tool, they may have a key management tool, they have a password management or secrets management type tool in there as well. So hardware security modules is supported as well, so that you can effectively create your own HSMs based on this environment. Now, a tool like Defender for Cloud, you can see mentions a native or cloud native application protection platform. And what we're seeing also over the years with Defender for Cloud is that sometimes Microsoft would have purchased or acquired a company and they would have tied that in maybe to the Defender product because they would have had different options. And let me just see if I've still, there we go. Just going to grab this URL and pop this in the chat as well, which basically gives you a bit of an overview, as you can see, of Defender products and services. So we're not talking about just one Defender XDR, endpoint, O365, identity, vulnerability management, IoT, so a few different options down there as well. So implementing Defender for Cloud, you, like most of the services in Microsoft, would get essentially like a dashboard type view. And you can see here we've got an overview showing us our security posture, showing us things like regulatory compliance in here as well. So again, where are you located? Are you talking about health compliance in the US like HIPAA? Are we talking about GDPR maybe in Europe? And you can see things like Reserve Bank of India in this case, obviously being mentioned. So, seeing those particular objects in there. Let's zoom back out properly. And vulnerability assessment. So when you're kind of doing a comparison here and essentially saying we've deployed a bunch of virtual machines into Azure, we need to make sure that they are they don't have, should I say, any particular vulnerabilities. And we're not just talking about VMs here. You might be uploading containers into the likes of the Azure registry. And if that's the case, are they or do they have any known vulnerabilities as well? So you can see things like AKS clusters are mentioned here as well. So your Kubernetes service. So scanning, we'll get detailed scans, including the vulnerability report. So you can come down here, you can obviously click on one of these options, like this one that's got a red box around it, the container registry image has vulnerability findings, and then you can drill down into that. Also, we might talk about malicious software. So what if we've got virtual machines that we need to scan? So we've got a VM, someone's gone and installed an application into here. We want that kind of capability of being able to, in near real time, verify that. So here we've got detect malicious files upon an upload. So someone's gone and uploaded something into, say, your storage account. So we've enabled Defender for Storage up here. And based on that, we want to detect malicious software. And also with our detecting threats to sensitive data, again, when we talked about things like your data classifications, you do have, as I say, the different types of Defender options. On the right here, we're seeing storage, prioritizing security alerts on our sensitive data that we might be putting into our storage accounts. And then also gaining visibility into your data and your estates there. So this scanning does integrate with the likes of the Purview for things like policy assignments. So there are options with your vulnerability scans. There is the built-in or the capability through Microsoft Defender, as you can see, offered in both Defender 1 or Plan 1 and Plan 2. That's auto-enabled for machines with endpoint vulnerability management. Doesn't require any extra software, but there's also options like Qualys. So if you use Qualys vulnerability scanners, then you can see there, if you're talking about third parties, then that one does, require the integration with the actual Qualys tool. Then, as always, in a security environment, we need to think about monitoring, because if we can't collect and log collect logs, sorry, and monitor this environment, then, how do we establish baselines? So lots of our security components would essentially say log as much as you possibly can so that we can put this. And in the Azure space, we'll talk about what we call a log analytics workspace, where you say, yep, just dump all that effectively into this location. And then once we put it into there, how do we analyze it? How do we check and how do we respond based on that monitoring here as well? As you would expect with logs, you can perform your own custom queries. It uses a language called KQL, custom query, Kusto query language, not custom query language, Kusto in there, very SQL-like anyway. Then we have a service like Sentinel. So Microsoft Sentinel for things like threat detection and mitigation. So how do we go and collect the data across our environment? How do we look at threats? And then when we talk about this, you see the main discussion here is this is a cloud native security information and event management. So SIEM and SOAR, to discuss how you would also respond to those types of events. So when you talk about the orchestration and how you would actually respond. So collect the data, detect for threats, and then start investigating those and then respond to those as part of that automation. So do configure automation rules, do use things like playbooks as part of that process, and that's all part of the SOAR integration there to discuss our orchestration and automation aspect from our response. We also have things like the Service Trust Portal, and let me just, let's just go to here and type in Service Trust. So for those that are looking at the compliance requirements, you can see here we've got our certifications, regulation standards, ISO, SOC, GDPR, etc. And there's reports, white papers, and artifacts. And then you can save things to your library in here as well. And download these based on your compliance requirements. So that basically is a quick overview, as you can see, of some of our Azure services, from a security perspective. And as I mentioned, just towards the start of this, a lot of that is we deep dive into that in this AZ500. So the AZ500 is our security engineer course. It is a 4-day course, and there is an associated certification that you can get from that as well. Other courses here, like the 104, as you can see, is an Azure administrator. There are also some of the sort of security compliance ones. So you see things like SC100. Well, we could have probably just chucked SC200 on there as well, SC900. So there's a few different types of options. So if you're someone that's just getting into Azure, there is also the AZ900, which is a 1-day fundamentals. So things like AZ900, 1 day, 104, 500, those are 4-day offerings in there as well. So so that's kind of just what I said, which will basically help you towards that certified associate level. Focusing on those, the exam for that is very much the key focus of what you cover. So what you cover in the course content is what you expect to see in the actual exam. So, and Fiona, did you get that link at all from earlier? Sure. No, okay. So I'm sure that if necessary, just fill in the survey. Okay, cool. Thank you. So as it says there, just a post-webinar survey will pop up after the webinar, express your interest, etc. But any questions there? I have not seen, unless I've missed things in the chat. So nothing coming in there at all. Oh, Paul says you're not seeing anything that you have posted. Oh, apologies for that. That would be my fault from not switching. I'm sorry about that, Paul. Let me just chuck a few of those in there. That was the Defender reference. What else did I put in there? I don't think there was. Right. Okay. Yeah, there was just those couple in there. So hopefully you're seeing those now, Paul. So as I say, that just reference the Defender that I just showed you from a products. Cool. Good stuff. And also that comparison to the P1, P2 licensing. Now, I'm not sure whether anyone here also is a bit familiar with maybe AWS environments, and they may already be. And oh, okay, Fiona says, "Yep, we'll be sending those out." Sometimes people will say, "Oh, well, what's the comparison?" I get people that come on AWS courses that work with Azure for a long time, and I get people that come on Azure courses that work with AWS. So there is this document that I've just pasted into the chat window, and you may have already seen it here. This is from the Azure side. So you can see if we kind of scroll down to some of the security section, storage, containers, serverless, database, get there eventually. Security, well, you can see identity stuff. So in something like AWS, that's called IAM. Here it's Entra ID. Yeah, there's role-based authentication. There's lots of obviously Entra ID here. Policy is the equivalent to AWS config for those that are used to that. So part of the compliance is code stuff. Your encryption options, so KMS, Key Vault. You've got your firewall, which is WAF and WAF as such. Then you come down to security here. Defender for cloud, the kind of most closely related AWS service is called AWS Inspector. If you're looking at Sentinel, the closest related one there is GuardDuty. The Service Trust portal that we just looked at is called Artifact, and DDoS protection is actually called Shield in there. So I know a lot of people, I get questions. You may have already seen that previously anyway, but it's one of those that sometimes people say, well, look, we are currently using this. What's the effective equivalent in there? So I've given a little bit of time there for someone, and I haven't seen anything pop in the chat window. So anything else before we wrap things up? As it says, the link will pop up here after the webinar ends. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you. And Fiona says, yeah, yep, thank you for everyone for attending. Also, if you've got any further questions, yes, please contact the Likes of Bespoke. And yeah, complete the webinar. And other than that, hope you have a nice lunch, or depends on where you are. 3 o'clock for me might be lunchtime if you're on Eastern time, or if you're in WA, obviously a couple of hours earlier. So yeah, have a good rest of your day, and maybe I'll see you around sometime.